Hi, everybody. My name is Cassidy Pearsall. I'm from the ARRI Americas Solutions Group, and I will be trying to keep these guys in line for the next hour. So thank you for joining us. We're really excited for this talk today. I think it's going to be really eye-opening for a lot of people, and also just a good overview, like Eric said, of what SMPTE and ESTA are up to in terms of standardizations for virtual production. We are with a very unique set of gentlemen who I know could talk about this for 3 days straight if we let them. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to lob some questions out to particular members, and then the idea is it's really conversational. If anyone wants to jump in and add anything, let's just go ahead. Let's keep it light, let's keep it fun, and let's keep it informative. So starting next to me, we have Marcus Bengtsson. He is the CTO of Original Syndicate and the best. So next, we have Tim Kang. And wait, I gotta look at your title, because I just know you as Jim. I mean, he just did his intros, but for anyone who wasn't here for the previous panel, which was great, he is a DOP as well as the principal engineer of color imaging at Quasar Science. Moving down, we have Scott Blair. Scott is the VP of Product and Project Management at Megapixel VR. And after that, we have the infamous Dave Stump, ASC. Almost needs no introduction. Finally, we have Ritchie. He's the director of R&D for Fuse Technical Group, and I'm so happy to have you guys here. Happy to be here myself. So I'm gonna hop right into it. Dave, you're holding the mic, so you get the first question, but like I said, if anyone wants to jump in, you guys just violently rip the mic out of Dave's hand, I guess. So first of all, and I can pose this to the whole group, so think hard about it. Why do we need standards?
Well, I'm going to explain that in terms of a dictionary of terms. When we talk to each other, we understand the concepts that we're communicating to each other because we use the same words to mean the same things. And there are subtle differences in language. And sometimes you'll use one word for something and I'll use another word for the same thing. And most of the time that works when human beings are talking to other human beings. However, when machines are talking to machines, if you don't use precisely the same word, spelled precisely the same way, in precisely the same syntax, one machine can't understand the other. Computers are really dumb. And standards right now are part and parcel of defining the terminology and creating a definition of the terms that we use to communicate, from photons to sensors to lenses to cameras to workflows. And it's really urgent. Right now is the critical moment for us to define terms as a standards body.
Well, I think that was a great outline of why computers need standards to communicate with each other. We don't want to be existing in a Tower of Babylon-esque situation when we're having these increasingly complex systems coming on. What are some of the current efforts by SMPTE or ESTA, of which many of you are either both members or a member of one committee, that are currently being explored for the world of virtual production in particular? I'm going to start with Marcus because he raised his hand, but then why don't we give the other... Okay, and we'll give it down to Ritchie in a second.
Yeah.
Marcus?
Thank you, Cassidy. I think the biggest one that we're working on right now, which is obviously within SMPTE RIS and also ESTA, which is a different standardization body, is about camera tracking. Camera tracking, tracking lens metadata, tracking what cameras do and do not, and how they communicate that metadata to different devices that may be interested in it. Today, the landscape is it's full of proprietary protocols. Like essentially every single camera tracking manufacturer or lens manufacturer have their own way of communicating positional data or lens characteristics, and that's something that these initiatives are trying to solve, essentially to improve interoperability between devices and ensure that we can maintain a consistent high quality of this critical type of data, which is in virtual production, camera tracking. Ritchie?
Hi, so I'm a co-chair for the interop group of the RIS, and that the whole purpose of this group is to allow for that communication between all of the devices and to really interoperate. We're seeing so many devices from different fields come together in virtual production specifically. So we've got camera tracking, and we've got LED displays that came from a different application previously. We've got game engines, and all these things survived on their own in their own niches before, but now we're having to pull them together and put something bigger together with all of them, and that's really the key for this interoperability. There's lots of protocols within games for how they communicate to each other, or object tracking, motion tracking within the motion tracking world, but really pulling it together and saying, okay, we need this real-time game engine to understand real-time motion data or camera metadata. That's really been the challenge. So, Scott?
Yeah. So, following on all of this, one of my favorite lines is, the great thing about standards is everybody's got one. So when you're dealing in our industry, any industry, you have lots of proprietary standards, as Ritchie said, but the other thing is that you have competing standards sometimes too between different organizations. It's really critical landing on a standard that everybody can adopt, that you can have continuity with, and that will stand the test of time. It's one of the critical challenges. In ESTA, we had started working on projects for camera and motion tracking, and then adding camera tracking to it as a streaming protocol. But then we became aware of work going on in RIS as well, so we're trying to combine our efforts so that we don't have two competing standards, different ways of doing things, that we can harmonize on terminology, that we can put the two things together and be more powerful working together rather than having separate ways of doing different things that don't interoperate. Lighting, as Ritchie listed a great list of all the different disciplines that have all had their own standards and come together. Lighting is very much the same thing, and we're seeing now from Tim's previous talk, the kind of the hybridization of lighting and video. Lighting for decades, we've all come to DMX 512 and streaming ACN, but now we're in a world where we have lighting that's being fed with video, but still you're controlling the intensity from the lighting. So how do all these things work together? How do you synchronize what is now the lighting with the video as you start doing a lot of virtual production techniques where you've got hidden frames and hidden things going on? So it's very much the Wild West. There's a lot of opportunity here, and it's really important and critical to tackle these things early and get them right.
So I think all of you guys brought up a really good point here. We've been talking about camera tracking, camera metadata, but we're talking about different vendors and different manufacturers. It's this push and pull between clients, customers, what they need, what they're looking for, and what individual vendors are willing to provide and also interested in protecting. I kind of see it as a chicken and egg type of situation. What comes first? The product's introducing a data protocol that is very robust and maybe simple enough that could be adopted by others, or is it the standard defining what customers are looking for and then the implementation coming from the vendors themselves?
I'm pretty sure it's going to always come from products first. Because standards, it's like, it's like the Webster Dictionary. When they announce you put a word into the dictionary, it only makes it in there because it's being used, right? So products are where things start getting used, and you start seeing where things are working, where not working, and multiple standards, whatever. And when you find something that works the best and what everyone's using and it becomes the de facto standard, then you codify it. Right, so that's pretty much, I think, how things generally work.
I'll just add a short bit to that. I've been writing standards in ESTA for 24 years now, chaired a lot of task groups developing standards, and the one common thread I can point to, and at least in my experience of developing standardized protocols that turn into ANSI standards, is the ones that we've seen that have been successful are the ones that did start out of existing proprietary implementations where companies put their IP on the table, work together then to make something that was better than they started from, that the whole industry could use. The blue sky projects, protocols, where we were trying to tackle something ambitious that there wasn't already an existing proprietary model for, those are the ones where we tend to stumble a lot and have a lot of challenges.
And one of the pain points of evolving a standard is taking different companies or different systems or different protocols that are de facto standards for different manufacturers and putting everyone in a room and allowing them to chafe each other and evolve all of their different technologies into a uniform technology that everyone can agree on. That is a lot harder than you would think it is, but it is the key to standards bodies, and it's the reason that we have organizations like SMPTE. I liken it to a big wrestling ring where everyone can get in and wrestle out for who gets what in the ultimate standard that becomes a uniform standard.
I guess on that note, what are either current efforts or efforts that you think could be tried by organizations and committees like SMPTE and ESTA to incentivize vendors to get into the ring and start having those conversations instead of working on their development in silos?
It's actually a really good question. I think from a manufacturer perspective, it comes down, I think a well-written and well-implemented standard where everybody has collaborated on getting to a point where we all agree on how things are going to be doing has the potential to reduce, for example, support burden on a manufacturer. You remove that level of unknown if there is a common standard on how to do things. I also think that a lot of these standards, they also, not only do they come with hundreds of pages documentation how to do things, most often there's a open source initiative associated with the standard that might contain already written code or libraries that are very easy for you as a manufacturer or as a vendor to just incorporate into your own code base. So participating in these standards can actually reduce your workload as a manufacturer.
Dave?
And as manufacturers build products and put them into the marketplace, we, the users, plug them into other products. And the key to the success of selling a product is that it plugs in and plays well with all of the other machines and devices in a workflow. So the better products adhere to standards, the better they plug into other products, the more products they sell.
Could I just follow up on that and say that as users, we also want to communicate to the manufacturers what we're trying to do. I think, especially in this space, it's developing so rapidly, and getting that feedback to the manufacturers to know what problems they're supposed to be, well, not maybe supposed to be, could be solving for us is super valuable.
I would say, as one of the two manufacturers in this panel here, I think that it's interesting that I've thought about this for a long time, because I'm very, very involved with not necessarily sharing secrets, but more advocating for basically de facto standards in my world. And my philosophy comes more from the miracle of 34th Street. You know, it's when you have two competing stores and they start pointing out the other, if they don't have something, you go to the other store to buy buy what you need from the other store. They got the other competing store's catalog there, right? It was kind of a comedic point of the movie, but what's really going on there is selflessness actually is paradoxical in that the more selfless you are as a person, especially as a manufacturer, people tend to like that more, and they tend to buy your stuff more, and sales increase because people notice that. And I think that's a really important thing that I've found to start happening with my efforts in Quasar. So.
Oh, thanks. So as users, one of the most important things I've been telling, users at trade shows for years is beat up on the manufacturers. When there is a standard, when there are open standards available, push the manufacturers to implement them. It's in everybody's interest. Manufacturers, have, especially in software products, there is a feature list a mile long. It doesn't matter what the product is, there's always a huge feature list. Standards take work to, protocols take work to implement and support, and features are on the list, in the order by the amount of people asking for them. So if people aren't asking for standards to get implemented, then they don't get implemented. They fall down the priority list. So the more the users are screaming to say support this, then the more likelihood you're going to see it show up supported in the product sooner. And that's the reality of it. And for manufacturers, should get involved in standards organizations and involved in standardization early, if nothing else, out of their own self-preservation. Because as Dave was saying, being in the room while the standards are being written gives you a voice in what it is. Waiting, taking a wait and see approach until after the standard is done to then decide if you want to implement or not. Well, there might be critical features and things that, capabilities that could have existed that you need for your product, but because you weren't at the table, those things didn't get incorporated in. So as users, push for standards to be implemented, and as manufacturers, protect your own interests and be involved.
So I think you guys have brought up a really interesting concept of the customer feedback loop or the user feedback loop within all of this, whereas we've been talking about, SMPTE and as committee members, in some people's mind, maybe sitting up high, with an overview of the system, but not, deep in the guts of what we have going on. What are some current efforts of either by SMPTE or ESTA on how to encourage user feedback, how to invite people to the table, how to bring people to the room? And is the process of writing a standard a democratic process? Is it something where everybody is going to have an equal say, or are those that are in some respects maybe more qualified going to define and then educate the users on how that could be best implemented in their systems? Whoever wants it.
I think all of us could talk about that. I'll give somebody else a chance to go.
Well, one of the things that I've been doing in this group at SMPTE is going deep into my phone book and calling manufacturers of lenses and of cameras and of every kind of device that fits in our imaging chain, and pretty much encouraging, coaching, sometimes bullying them into participating, and sometimes even shaming them into participating. However we get them there, it's important that they participate.
5 seconds, Tim. I was going to say that if you're a user today and you find yourself complaining about the lack of interoperability between devices, then you should involve yourself in standardization. So everybody should ask yourself that question, and then the answer is obvious.
Yeah, I think also as a representative of the RIS, we really do encourage you to get involved. So as users, if you're feeling like we're not being inclusive or inviting your voice in this, please let us know. We do want that feedback, and it depends on it for what we're trying to accomplish here.
One thing that actually has helped me as a user myself, as a cinematographer, is the chapter meetings in different locations, especially in Hollywood. Having really compelling, interesting demos or demonstrations or examples of new technologies or new things that are using new standards or whatever the case is me, has inspired me as a user to say, I need this in this, in this, and this because of what I saw at that meeting. So I also believe these SMPTE chapter meetings are really critical for that, because that's a very public, forward-facing way to demonstrate the need for standardization, because you're showing these new technologies and they can make my life better. So I think that's also a really important thing to know as a user. If there's a SMPTE chapter nearby you or a part of you and they are doing demonstrations like that, or I think they're published online, that's actually a really great resource to know what it is I should put in my stuff. So, or what want manufacturers to put in their products. So.
I'm going to take it to one more kind of subject before we get into our Q&A, because I feel like we've drifted away from the subject of virtual production and more about actual just standards for data protocol. So when we had an email chain going before we did this panel talking about what we wanted to cover, and one of the interesting questions for anyone that's not familiar or practitioner with virtual production, it is a cobbled together stack of cards, or like when you open a closet and you have everything very particularly placed to not fall out, but as soon as you move one thing you have to rebalance the whole structure. It's a lot of different industries, it's a lot of different pieces of technologies coming together. A lot of studios and companies have, I wouldn't say necessarily proprietary workflows, but they have a workflow that works for them through blood, sweat, tears, and years of testing and figuring out what works for their staff. In your guys' opinion, and I'm going to start with Ritchie because he has a mic, what are some of the areas of VP that standardization might potentially stifle or be seen as stifling rather than freeing and opening up interoperability between devices?
For sure. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a very creative process, so we want to encourage that, and we don't want to push people into a certain way of doing things. I think there's a dynamic here with the users and the clients. A lot of people working in VP are very technical already, and so we want to give them the tools and let them kind of assemble the final product that best suits what their vision is. And we want to provide the building blocks for that and some of the glue, but we want to let them kind of do the assembly or have the design for it.
I think one of the things that I see in the last 20 years in technology is not the technology itself, but the pace of change of technology. And I think we have had to learn how to learn faster in the digital era. Film was around for 80 or 100 years and kind of didn't really do much of anything different. And then when digital came along, we learned digital, and then in 2 years we learned it all over again. And then another year or two, we learned it all over again. And we have had to learn it multiple times, including right now, since digital technology began being used for motion picture production.
I think there's also, a difference. We've talked a lot about standards, but a big effort of what is happening in SMPTE with RIS is really around, workflows and best practices. And those are maybe a bit subtle, but very distinctly different than standards themselves. And the rate that the industry is evolving, the speed virtual production is evolving, is just so fast that standards themselves, proper, ANSI, SMPTE, IEEE standards, are measured. Development time can be measured on those in the order of, years, if not sometimes over a decade, on projects I've worked on, and that's just too slow for our industry. So I think SMPTE has really gotten it right here with RIS in being able to very quickly iterate on workflows and some best practice types of standardization that are useful to the members out there now. And then the technical standards, communication standards will follow from that, and those take longer. But the industry is just evolving so fast that it can be very hard for standards themselves to keep up.
So on kind of the subject of that, I guess in the process of these workflow advisements, these best practices, these tips, tricks, and advice that SMPTE and ESTA can offer on the workflow side of things, rather than just the device communication side of things, how to best implement these standards that are being put in place, what is the actual process of distributing those workflow documents, tips and tricks evangelizing, training. And you don't have to say this as representatives of SMPTE or ESTA. You can say this of what, as individuals, of what you think you would respond to or your teams would respond to well, or the people in production houses that you normally work with. Once a standard is defined or a workflow is defined, how do we best get everybody on board so it becomes widely implemented and we can begin iterating on that?
It's what we said. It's what we just said earlier. You got to put it in products. Just put it in products, and then so that when a person needs to use something and do something, they see the button that has that thing in there. Like when I say I want an HDR output, I see ST2084, and I click on that. Now I've got PQ curve, or I don't know what it's called now. I can never keep it straight. But there's an actual thing that I can choose, and it just works.
So what you're saying is the onus of the documentation, the training, and the designation of how to utilize those buttons is on the vendors. So how do we ensure that the vendors are equally prepared to advocate for those standards, teach in a unified way? Are there plans for SMPTE or ESTA to advise vendors on how best to implement those strategies and then distribute it to the masses?
That's not a question for me.
Does anyone want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, the RIS does have an education work stream to it, so I think there's great opportunities there for us on the interop side to pull this together, but then pass it to the education stream to get it out into the world. The SMPTE, the RIS wall chart, I don't know how we're referring to it these days, is a good first crack at that in terms of putting the workflow together, showing how the different departments interact with each other. So again, separate from the products, but here's the VAD, here's what they're responsible for, here's on-set work, here's post, here's archival, all that stuff. It really doesn't have to do with the gear anymore. It's more the function, how is the information flowing through the system, and that is part of the mandate of the RIS, is to get that information out there.
So, would you like to go? No.
I was going to say one other thing is, that's an important component of this is, as Tim was saying, for things to be able to work together. When you show up and you plug them together and they work together, industry events like Plug Fest and things like that, where manufacturers come together and do interoperability testing with the engineers from every company, not the sales guys, not the support guys, but the engineers actually bringing products together, testing interoperability is so critical and key, so that way when you get to the field and you're on site, on production, you have a lot more confidence that things work together. And so it's another important thing as users, as plug fests and things do evolve, it's always important to ask manufacturers if they participate in those and if they test their product in those, because that can make a huge difference.
So Scott, I'm going to leave this with you actually. Like I said, we had a conversation going ahead of time about what we wanted to cover in this panel, what we wanted to explore, and I thought your example of DMX being established and so many further standards or attempts at standards coming and trying to knock it down was really telling about what a standard really can do for an industry and how it can really change the development trajectory for vendors because of its qualities of being simple to implement, simple to understand, and very, very versatile in the types of data that it can be assigned to, essentially. So I have your favorite question. Do you have any examples of standards that have gone wrong and what we can learn from them moving forward?
Oh, yeah. We've got, 3 more hours? 4? Okay. Yeah, so working in ESTA, writing standards for 24 years, like any product development or anything else, you're going to find the things that work, you're going to find the things that don't. I would postulate that DMX 512 is both the best and the worst industry standard all at the same time, and for the same reasons. It's great because it is a simple protocol anybody can implement. the entire lighting industry as we know it is built upon it. Nobody ever intended that to happen in the way that it has. That was not, divine intervention. It just evolved and occurred. And it's because it was so simple, and the data is not, the data that goes across the wire has no inherent meaning. It's untyped data. It's reliant on the console to understand what the device is at the other end, to have a fixture library for the things to actually interoperate and work, which is why it's also hated so much. As you start getting into projects where you try to get a lot more intelligence in the protocols, where things can describe themselves to each other, that's when it gets a lot more complicated, and it takes longer to implement, takes longer to design, doesn't necessarily even have as long of a lifetime if it's not extensible and flexible, just as we've seen everything rapidly evolve in virtual production. The protocols have to be able to age gracefully. And that's one of the things about the MX512 is it's aged fairly gracefully, considering the amount of things we do with that protocol. Media server control, when it was a protocol that was only designed to ever control dimmers and never viewed as anything more. The successful protocols, I find, are the simple ones. They're the ones, as said earlier, that started from a proprietary standard, an internal standard in a company, that were then taken and turned into a public standard, or the basis of a public standard. That's really where the successful ones, in my experience, lie. The ones where we in ESTA, eat our own dog food here. In ESTA, we had a next generation protocol effort to replace, to kill DMX512 that spent over 15 years in development. And at the end, it finally got released as a standard, but it really wasn't implementable. It was more of a academic project at the end of the day, because it was far too complex and it didn't actually solve the problems that needed to solve. So having a foundational basis of something tangible existing that works really is one of the big differentiators.
I think Betamax and HD DVD are other examples, because it's not just, is it a good or bad standard, it's also just what happens on the market too. I think that's another really important consideration to make. And I thought it was kind of funny to think about it, but there is really deep implications to understand that too. So you have to be able to make sure that the standard you choose is also the one that sells the most. So, yeah.
All right, well, I think we're going to move into a Q&A now, but before I do that, are there any other final thoughts from you guys? If there's any plugs you want to do for your local SMPTE chapter, or any information you want to provide to the audience about how to get in contact with the RIS group or with ESTA in order to give their feedback and opinions?
Not a plug per se, but no, I would just say, like, if you're a manufacturer and you provide products, equipment that are being used in virtual production, then please feel encouraged to participate in all these standardization efforts. Like, we need your feedback, we need your input, and if you're a user, start asking your manufacturers, your vendors, to implement the standards that exist. If they don't, then put some pressure on them. I think that's my final message.
The only other plug I've got is for Ryan, who just joined the SMPTE RIS as the project manager. If you want to sign up for it, talk to him. He's the guy. He's been signing people up at a pretty fast clip lately, and it's really been great to see more involvement in the group.
Do we have a URL?
Thank you, Ryan. Yes, Ryan.
We don't have
Okay, I'm going to open it up. I don't know if you can hear me very well. I'm going to open it up for questions now, and I'm going to be the mic girl, I guess. No, you're going to answer. Or Mindy will. Yay!
I got this. All right. from our audience. We got some questions over here already.
Okay, so some of you are already familiar with me. So the bottom line is we already have standards. Standards for the video camera. The camera produces electronic signal, right? We can measure that on a scope. Those standards already exist, right? Luminance and chroma. We do have charts that are calibrated to those scopes, such as this. Each part is calibrated. So here's the whole thing. I can respond to that camera through standards. Everything has to come to that camera. We're doing virtual work. So we turn around and deal with virtual software. You can turn around and put charts into that. You calibrate the camera. The video wall itself is calibrated. The lights are... Put the button? Okay. The bottom line is everything has to equal to the camera. The other thing that's standard is that each camera has a different response, right? So one thing is not universal. So my whole point is there are standards that exist, right? There's a measuring tape for the camera in the use of scopes, right? So if you turn around and do that, even using scopes in Unreal and going from there, making sure everything equals. And the other thing too is all of a sudden you change the camera, all of those things change because the camera response change. So that's the only thing I'd say is to start using standards that already exist.
Definitely agree on the camera side. I'm not sure if you were here for the talk that Tucker and I did an hour ago, but there's no standards for the displays and the linearity of the displays, the color reproduction, so that's something that we're addressing. And we can discuss after if there's...
I won't take too long, but the bottom line is I've done that sort of thing with displays. You're right, but having that control and saying, here's where we are, here's where we need to be, and you can draw to it. That's all. So if you're using the scopes as your standard, you know where it's off, because you're relying that it's based on the camera. Anyways.
Yep, that's an excellent point, and having diagnostic tools throughout the workflow is very important. That's something that, again, we're putting together here or understanding. Just the interactions, as Tim talked about as well, between the color matching function in the camera and the primaries in the displays, and just understanding how all of that comes together, and then putting the tools together, the diagnostics, to make sure that what you are getting is what you expect, and it's not an eyeballed thing, which is unfortunately the case in a lot of instances today.
Okay, so I'm part of the SMPTE RIS OSVP as well. Work with Ritchie. One of the things that you were mentioning, I think, is one of the things that we've been working on, which is camera 12 calibration and setting a repeatable workflow for it. And it's very, very complicated, but we're all tackling that. It's the most complicated thing in VP right now. Do you guys want to mention a little bit about that, the camera 12 calibration and where we are with it? Because it's probably the most complex thing in the pipeline of VP.
It's very hard. I think where I think it needs to go is just the way that you use a calibration puck on a monitor, right? And you run patches, and you got software that reads those patches, and you compare signal and the response of the camera out. That needs to happen where live and just in the same seamless process with a camera looking at a wall and the camera's the calibration puck. And you have to be able to just hit play on, or calibrate, or go, or action, or whatever the software will need to be. And I think that workflow is already existent. It's already there. I think it needs to be it needs to be calibration software companies need to be able to now be able to take a video signal in from a camera and make that the feedback loop there, and that just solves so many problems. I think that's where things need to go, at least to simplify that issue, because it is complicated right now and really hard. So.
Check. There is a phenomenon that I call the light bulb moment, which is when someone sees a workflow or a process or a camera or an effect who has not participated in it and not helped to create it, stands behind the camera and sees it all come together, and you can literally very frequently see the light bulb go off over their head, and suddenly it makes sense. Well, industry-wide, it takes a long time for all of those light bulbs to go off. And it takes a long time for all of our community to own the technique and understand where the pitfalls and the problems with it are. And then the evolution starts to happen. And for example, LED wall screens, obviously, or semi-obviously, there are colors that they don't make. They trick your eye into thinking that you're seeing those colors, but most LED walls do not make the color yellow. And if you saw the two narrow metameric spikes of red and green that are telling your mind you're seeing yellow, there's no yellow in them, but you still somehow see yellow. That sets off a light bulb over manufacturers' heads and tells them, aha, I've got to make an LED system that will actually make real yellow.
How do you avoid, like, one standard that I've always found very problematic is HDR, because there are so many different types of HDR standards. There's Dolby Vision, there's HDR10, there's Beta. How do you avoid too many standards, and who says which standard is the standard?
Like I said earlier, that's a great thing about standards. Everybody's got one, and that is really, you know, the big challenge is for companies to work together with industry associations, you know, like SMPTE, like ESTA, to create standards. Too often we see consortiums of companies coming together to kind of make their own, you know, faux standard, you know, I call it sometimes, where the group of companies will come together under a banner of, you know, something they develop as a kind of a semi-proprietary thing that competes with the other consortium of companies' semi-private things. And so that's really the challenge is you know, getting everybody kind of under one big tent working together to prevent that.
Time and consumers, the users of the technology, are the things that obsolete standards. So we no longer broadcast in 525 Rec 601, and that's a perfect example of a standard that has been obsoleted by time and by the consumer.
I think your example is good as well. Like, when HDR started, there were a number of competing ones, but they've filtered down, and the successful one has made it through, I guess, or depending on the use case, but it does go through that period of submission. A bunch of people submit different options or ways to do something, and then a group like SMPTE or ESTA get involved and choose from that. And that, again, comes back to being involved in the bigger bodies and saying, we're going to put something out to be standardized, submit your proprietary example now, whether it's compression or a PQ curve or whatever, or an EOTF curve or whatever it is, a color space, something like that. And it is that submission process, and it's a conversation. It's a back and forth between the vendors and the organizing bodies.
Well, this is a SMPTE panel, so there is no other HDR standard besides PQ, right, or ST2084, right? So I don't know why you asked that question, right? No, I'm kidding. Obviously kidding. No, but seriously, like, I really do think that as my colleague Scott here mentioned, is I think simplicity really makes a big difference. And I'm not going to say which one was more simple for me to figure out as I've been testing it, but one is a lot more easy for me to compute and start testing and putting into a product, and the other is I'm still confused by it. And I'm choosing one right now to test because it is easy to figure out. It's very clear. And the other one is I still don't know what to do. So I think for me as a manufacturer, I'm choosing one standard just because A, it just works better for me to test with and work with and implement. So I think it's Occam's razor ultimately. So that's what it boils down to. So.
All right.
Yes. So I just want to say as well, like to Tim's point, standardization, like writing the documents is step one, but then getting adoption from the mass market, consumers and producers, that's really the key. So to Sam's question, it's like there are all these HDR standards out there. Some of them are standards, some of them are just protocols, and really the one that we should be focusing on is the one that has reached the most mainstream adoption, because that's the one we want to use. Whether that is a open standard or a proprietary standard, that can be changed as well.
All right, I guess that's a wrap then. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Eric.
Okay.